The morning my ex walked into my bakery with her new girlfriend, I had flour on my cheek, a burn mark on my left wrist, and exactly 0 emotional armor. That's the thing about owning a bakery in the French Quarter. You're always the most vulnerable person in the room, because you've been awake since 4 a.m. turning raw dough into something warm, and the world doesn't reward that kind of softness. It just walks through your door smelling like someone else's perfume and orders a croissant, like it didn't once tell you that you were too rooted to love properly. I handed over the croissant. I smiled. I charged her full price and did not give her the loyalty stamp. That was 6 months ago, and I'd like to tell you I was over it. But the truth is I hadn't let anyone stand close enough to the counter to find out. My name is Savannah. I'm 34 years old. I own Maison Dorée on Rue Dauphine, and I wake up before the city remembers it's alive. My parents built this place with money they didn't have and faith they'd borrowed from somewhere even deeper, and when they handed me the keys 12 years ago, they didn't hand me a business. They handed me a responsibility that I wear like a second skin. The smell of this bakery is the first thing I remember, and the last thing I think about before I fall asleep. Butter, vanilla, the particular sweetness of caramelized sugar on a Tuesday. This place is the only thing in my life that has never asked me to be someone different. And if you think that sounds lonely, you might be right. But at least I was sleeping fine. Until the pink Fusca parked in front of my window. If you're new here, welcome. Drop your city in the comments below. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. And if this story already has you feeling something, go ahead and hit subscribe. There are 7 chapters to this story. And I promise you, by the end, you'll understand why a 1974 Volkswagen changed absolutely everything about the way I see Tuesday mornings. The first time I noticed the car, I thought it was a mistake. Not a parking mistake. An existence mistake. Like someone had taken a fever dream and given it a chassis. The Fusca was the particular shade of pink that exists between a peony and a sunset, and it had small terracotta pots wired to the rear bumper, a wreath of dried lavender on the roof, and what appeared to be a hand-painted sign on the passenger door that read, "Lily in the Road," in looping cursive. It sat in front of my bakery on a Wednesday in October, like it had always been there, like the French Quarter had been waiting for it specifically, and I stood at the window with a dish towel in my hands and thought, that cannot be street legal. Ruth, my counter manager of 14 years, walked up beside me, looked at the car, looked at me, and said nothing. Which, from Ruth, is the loudest possible commentary. The girl who climbed out of the Fusca moved the way people move when they've never once been in a hurry and have no intention of starting. She was wearing paint-stained overalls over a white linen shirt, her hair pulled back in a knot that was losing the argument with gravity, and she had a bucket of flowers balanced on her hip like it weighed nothing. Sunflowers, white peonies, branches of eucalyptus trailing over her arm. She set the bucket on the hood of the car, pulled out a small folding table from the back seat, unfolded it on the sidewalk with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, and began arranging flowers with her bare hands in the October morning air. I watched her for 47 seconds before I realized my coffee was getting cold. Her name, I would learn later, was Lily Tran, 28 years old, daughter of Vietnamese immigrants who had settled in Métairie when she was 3, and she had been selling flowers out of that Fusca for 2 years, moving through different neighborhoods like a slow, fragrant tide. She had a permit for the Garden District and one for the Marigny, but not, as the city of New Orleans would make very clear in about 3 weeks, for the French Quarter. But on that first Wednesday, I didn't know any of that. All I knew was that the sidewalk in front of my bakery suddenly smelled like a garden, and people were stopping. Not just passing, stopping, pulling out their phones, buying flowers, and then, because they were already there, looking at my window display and coming inside. Ruth rang up 11 sales before 10 in the morning. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. I told myself I went outside to ask about the permit situation. I told myself that very sincerely, with great conviction, as I untied my apron and smoothed my hair back and walked to the door. I was a business owner with a legitimate concern about unlicensed vendors affecting foot traffic. This was professional due diligence. Ruth watched me from behind the counter with the expression of a woman who has seen everything and fears nothing. I opened the door. The October air hit me, thick with flowers and river and the faint, sweet rot that New Orleans wears like a signature. Lily was wrapping a bouquet of sunflowers in brown paper, talking to a customer, laughing at something. A real laugh, the kind that doesn't perform itself. She hadn't noticed me yet, and for one strange, unguarded moment, I stood in my own doorway and just watched her hands. She looked up, and here is the thing I have replayed approximately 400 times since. She didn't smile right away. She looked at me first. Really looked, the way people rarely do with strangers. And then she smiled, and it was slower than I expected, like a door opening instead of a light switching on. "You must be the bakery," she said. Not the baker, the bakery. Like I was the whole thing. The flour and the warmth and the smell and the years. I had no idea what to do with that, so I said something about permits, and she nodded like she'd been expecting it, and pulled a folded paper from her front pocket and handed it to me. It was not, in fact, a valid French Quarter permit. It was a drawing of a flower with a smiley face and the words working on it written underneath. I stared at it. She waited. Behind me, through the glass, I was 100% certain Ruth was laughing silently. I should have told her to move the car. Every reasonable, liability-aware, flour-dusted part of my brain was composing that sentence. Instead, I heard myself say, "Do you want coffee?" The words came out before I'd approved them, which almost never happens to me. Lily tilted her head and the loose pieces of her hair caught the morning light, and she said, "Only if it's as good as it smells in there." I turned around and walked back inside without answering. It was the closest thing to flirting I'd managed in 18 months, and I'm not proud of how much that terrified me. I made her coffee. I made it well. I brought it out in one of the good ceramic mugs, not the paper cups we use for to-go orders, and I told myself that was purely about reducing waste. Ruth, for the record, has never let me forget the mug. That morning set a pattern I didn't name for 3 weeks. Lily parked the Fusca. I made coffee. She brought in a small bunch of whatever was left at the end of her morning and left it on the counter without saying anything about it. Ruth arranged the flowers next to the register and started telling customers they were part of the ambiance. The foot traffic held. My croissant sales went up 14%, and every morning, around 8:15, Lily leaned against the counter with both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug and talked to me about things that had nothing to do with business. The way the light changed over the Mississippi in November, the name of the stray cat that lived behind the church on Chartres Street, the particular cruelty of beignet powder on dark clothing. She talked. I listened. I refilled her coffee twice and pretended I wasn't counting the minutes until she left so I could think about what she'd said in peace. On the 23rd day, she came in later than usual, and something was off. The Fusca was parked at an angle. One of the terracotta pots had cracked, and Lily's eyes had the particular flatness of someone who'd gotten bad news and was trying to carry it quietly. She ordered her usual, and I made it without asking. And when I set the mug down, she looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, uncertain, stripped of its easy warmth, and said, "I think they're going to make me move the car." I didn't say anything right away. I looked at her hands around the mug, at the soil still under her fingernails, at the crack in the terracotta pot she'd set on my counter without explaining why she'd brought it inside. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. The specific, inconvenient ache of not wanting someone to leave. I refilled her coffee, and then I said the thing that started everything. The thing I said was, "What if you stayed?" Not poetically, not with any particular grace. I said it the way you say something that's been sitting in your chest for 3 weeks quietly gathering weight. Flat, a little hoarse, like the words had worn themselves out waiting. Lily looked up from the mug. I was already rearranging the pastry display with my back half turned, because I have a long history of saying important things to inanimate objects, rather than to the person's face, and the almond croissants were an excellent audience. The silence behind me lasted exactly long enough for me to consider crawling into the proofing oven. Then Lily said, "Stayed where?" And I turned around and explained, badly, with too many words about foot traffic and the city permit structure and the way the flowers had affected the morning numbers, that I was proposing a formal arrangement. She could anchor the Fusca in front of Maison Dorée as a fixed vending point. We'd split the sidewalk space. She'd get a legitimate address for her permit application. I'd get the garden ambiance that had apparently turned my Tuesday croissants into a neighborhood event. Business. Purely business. Lily listened to all of it with her chin resting on her hand, and then said, "You tracked my croissant numbers?" I had a spreadsheet. I did not mention the spreadsheet. Ruth appeared from the back with a tray of pain au chocolat at the exact moment Lily said yes, which meant Ruth had either impeccable timing or had been listening from behind the curtain for the last 4 minutes. Knowing Ruth, it was the curtain. She set the tray down, looked at Lily, looked at me, and said, "She takes her coffee with 1 sugar, not 2, but she'll never correct you because she doesn't want to be a bother." Lily stared at her. I stared at her. Ruth went back behind the counter, as if she hadn't just narrated something neither of us had said out loud. Lily turned to me slowly and said, "How long has she worked here?" 14 years, I told her. "And is she always like that?" "Always," I said. Lily laughed, that real laugh again, the one that doesn't perform itself, and I felt the knot in my sternum loosen by approximately 1 thread. 1 thread is not nothing. 1 thread, when you've been wound tight for 1.5 years, is actually quite significant. The permit process took 11 days, which meant 11 days of Lily parking the Fusca in the gray zone between legal and evictable, and me watching the street from my window each morning with the specific anxiety of someone who has too much invested in a terracotta pot situation to pretend otherwise. She arrived each day at 7:20, which I knew, because I stopped pretending not to check. The Fusca announced itself before it arrived. There was a particular sound the engine made, a low, uneven hum that the neighborhood had apparently decided to absorb as ambient music, because I started hearing my regulars mention it. "Oh, the flower car's here," Mrs. Fontenot would say, already pulling out her wallet before she'd ordered her baguette. The Fusca had become a landmark in under a month, which said something about Lily's particular talent for making herself necessary without ever asking to be. What I noticed, in those 11 days, was the way Lily worked. She moved through her mornings with a kind of focused ease that I recognized but couldn't place at first. And then I realized it was the same quality I'd been told I had behind the counter, the thing my mother called knowing your hands. Lily knew her hands. She could wire a bouquet without looking, split stems at the right angle by feel, judge the water level in a bucket by the sound of a flower stem hitting the surface. She'd learned from her grandmother, she told me one morning, leaning in the doorway while I shaped a batch of boolies. Her grandmother had kept a garden in Saigon the size of a room, and had known the name of every plant in it, in 3 languages. Lily said this the way people say things they've carried for a long time. Not with weight, exactly, but with a kind of careful tenderness, like handling something that matters. I kept my eyes on the dough. I didn't trust my face. On the 4th day, it rained. A real New Orleans rain, the kind that arrives without negotiation and floods the gutters in minutes. Lily pulled a tarp over the Fusca's open trunk and stood under my awning with her arms crossed and her overalls darkening at the shoulders, watching the street fill with water. I brought her a towel. She laughed and said she was already wet, which was objectively true, and I stood there holding the towel like a person with no follow-through. She took it anyway, used it to dry her hands, and then just stayed there under my awning, watching the rain. I went back inside. I came back 3 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside her, and we watched the French Quarter flood in companionable silence for 20 minutes, which is, I would argue, a more intimate thing than most people give it credit for. The permit came through on a Friday, and Lily texted me a photo of it with 3 exclamation points and a drawing of a flower that looked exactly like the smiley face permit she'd handed me on day 1. I showed the photo to Ruth. Ruth said, "She drew you a flower." I said, "It's just a celebration of the permit." Ruth said, "She drew you a flower, Savannah." I put my phone in my apron pocket and went to check on the brioche. The brioche was fine. I was less fine. The distinction between Lily is good for business, and I think about Lily an unreasonable amount had been blurring at the edges for days, and I was doing the thing I do, which is apply more work to the problem and wait for it to resolve itself through the power of carbohydrates and routine. What I had not accounted for was the grand opening. Lily decided that the permit approval warranted a proper launch, not a large event. Just a morning where the Fusca looked its best. She brought extra inventory, and she made a small hand-lettered sign that read, "Lily and the Road, now officially here," with the Maison Dorée address underneath. She asked if I wanted to do something on my end. I made a small batch of flower-shaped shortbread and put them in the window. That was the extent of my participation. But when I arrived at 4 a.m. and found that Lily had gotten there before me, had been there since 3:30, apparently, because she'd strung a small line of paper lanterns between the Fusca's roof rack and my awning, casting the whole sidewalk in warm amber light. I stood on the empty street in the dark and felt something move through my chest like a slow, deep chord. I didn't have a word for it yet, but I felt it. By 9 that morning, the line extended to the corner. Ruth was working the register with the serene efficiency of someone who has seen success before and is not surprised by it, but she caught my eye once across the counter and raised an eyebrow in a way that communicated an entire paragraph. Lily was outside, selling flowers as fast as she could wrap them, laughing with strangers, tucking a loose gardenia behind the ear of a little girl whose mother was crying quietly for a reason she didn't explain. I watched that from the window. I thought about my mother, about the morning she handed me the keys, about the way she'd said this place gives people a reason to stop. I thought about paper lanterns at 3:30 in the morning. I wrapped 12 shortbreads in paper and took them outside and handed them to Lily without explanation. And Lily looked at the package, and then at me with an expression I still haven't fully translated, and said, "You made these for today?" I said I'd made them for the window. She nodded slowly, like she was deciding whether to believe me, and then smiled. Not the easy public smile she gave strangers, but something quieter, kept closer. I went back inside before I could do anything inadvisable with my face. The complication arrived at 11:15 in the shape of a woman named Daphne, who parked a white SUV across from the Fusca and stood on the sidewalk in a blazer, taking photos of the street. I didn't know who she was yet. Lily saw her first and went quiet in a way I hadn't seen before. Not sad, exactly, but careful. The kind of careful that has history behind it. When I asked, later, Lily told me that Daphne was her ex, that Daphne was also, not coincidentally, the regional manager for Gold Crust Artisan Bakeries, that Gold Crust had leased a space 2 blocks down on Bourbon Street, and that the grand opening of their French Quarter location was scheduled for exactly 3 weeks from Saturday. I absorbed this information behind the counter, both hands flat on the marble, and did the math that anyone would do. My biggest competitive threat and Lily's most complicated personal history had arrived in the same vehicle, at the same time, on what should have been a good morning. Ruth came to stand beside me. She looked at Daphne across the street. She looked at Lily, who was wrapping flowers again with her back to the SUV, and her jaw set in a way I was learning to read. Then Ruth looked at me. Really looked. The way she does when she wants to make sure the message lands. And said, "Baby, that woman didn't come here to buy bread." I knew that. I already knew that. What I didn't know, standing there with flour on my hands and paper lanterns still swaying above my awning, was exactly how far I was willing to go to protect what was growing on that sidewalk. And whether I was thinking about the bakery at all. I Googled gold crust that night after closing. I'm not proud of it, but I also Googled Daphne, which I'm even less proud of, and I sat at the kitchen table above the bakery with my laptop and a glass of wine I wasn't really drinking and learned that Daphne Rousseau was 36, had an MBA from Tulane, had grown Gold Crust's Louisiana region by 40% in 2 years, and had a LinkedIn photo where she looked like someone who had never once burned a batch of brioche or said something embarrassing to a woman holding flowers. I closed the laptop. I opened it again. I looked at the photo one more time. I closed it again. Then I went downstairs and made a test batch of my mother's cardamom rolls at midnight, which is what I do when I need to think without admitting I'm thinking. And I stood in my own bakery in the dark with flour on my hands and tried to be honest with myself about what exactly was bothering me. The gold crust threat was real. That part was easy to name. The other part, the part where Lily had gone quiet when she saw Daphne, the part where I'd noticed, the part where it had mattered to me that she'd gone quiet. That part I put back in its drawer and pushed the drawer shut with both hands. Lily didn't mention Daphne the next morning. She arrived at 7:20 with the Fusca loaded heavier than usual. Dahlias, mostly, deep burgundy ones that made the whole sidewalk look like it was on the edge of something. And she set up her table and arranged her buckets with the focused efficiency I'd come to recognize as her version of armor. I brought her coffee with 1 sugar and set it on the corner of her table without breaking her concentration, and she picked it up without looking and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was doing a lot of quiet work underneath the surface. I went back inside. I made myself not look through the window for 11 minutes, which is a personal record. Ruth watched me not looking and said nothing, which was somehow worse than if she'd said something. The gold crust situation became concrete 3 days later when a laminated flyer appeared in every storefront window on the block except mine. Bold gold lettering on white. Grand opening. Gold Crust French Quarter. Saturday, November 16th. Artisan quality, accessible prices. There was a coupon on the bottom for a free coffee with any purchase. I stood on the sidewalk, reading it through someone else's window, and felt the particular cold clarity of understanding that a fight was coming, whether I wanted one or not. Lily appeared beside me, read the flyer, and said, "Free coffee is a declaration of war in this neighborhood." It was the first time she'd acknowledged anything adjacent to the Daphne situation, and she did it so casually, so precisely, that I almost missed the fact that her shoulder was pressed against mine and neither of us moved away. I stayed very still. I said, "Then we need a strategy." Lily said, "We?" I said, "The block." She looked at me sideways. I looked at the flyer. We both knew I hadn't meant the block. The strategy meeting happened the following Tuesday at 6 in the morning, before either of us opened for the day, at the small table I keep in the back corner of the bakery for paperwork I never get to. I made café au lait and put out a plate of the cardamom rolls, and Lily sat across from me with a notepad and a pen that had a small sunflower on the cap, which I refused to find charming. We talked for 2 hours. Real talking. The kind where you interrupt each other and change your mind mid-sentence and draw bad diagrams on the back of receipts. Lily had ideas I wouldn't have thought of. A joint social media presence, weekly flour and bread bundles, a loyalty program that crossed both businesses, a Saturday morning market feel that could turn our corner into a destination rather than a stop. I had the numbers, the neighborhood relationships, the knowledge of what had been tried before and why it hadn't worked. Together, on the back of a flour delivery receipt, we sketched something that looked like it might actually be enough. When I looked up from the receipt, Lily was already looking at me and she said, "You're different when you're not behind the counter." I asked what she meant. She said, "You lean in." I looked down at the table and realized she was right. I was practically horizontal over the receipt, elbows flat, chin nearly level with my coffee cup. I sat up. She smiled and looked back at her notepad, and I spent the next 10 minutes pretending to review figures I had already memorized. Ruth arrived at 7, took one look at the table covered in notes and receipts and 2 empty café au lait cups, and said, "Should I make more coffee? Or are you two going to need the table for a while?" We needed the table for another 40 minutes. Ruth made more coffee. She also, I noticed, put a small vase of Lily's dahlias on the counter by the register, which she had never done before without being asked, and which I chose not to interpret because I was already interpreting enough things, and my daily quota was full. The plan that emerged from that morning was practical and executable and genuinely good. And I knew it was genuinely good because I've been in this business for 12 years, and I know the difference between an idea that sounds right and an idea that is right. What I hadn't planned for was how it would feel to build something with someone. The back and forth of it. The way Lily finished thoughts I'd started and started thoughts I finished. The way we'd landed on the same conclusion from opposite directions 3 separate times, and both laughed at it. I had forgotten that work could feel like that. I hadn't realized I'd forgotten. Daphne came back on Thursday. She didn't stop this time. Just drove the white SUV slowly past the bakery, past the Fusca, past the new hand-lettered chalkboard Lily had made for the sidewalk that read, "Fresh flowers and fresh bread." Corner of Dauphine. Every morning, I watched from the window. Lily was with a customer and didn't see the car, or if she saw it, she gave no sign, and I found myself watching her face for a signal she wasn't sending, and understanding that I was doing it not for competitive intelligence, but for something much more personal and considerably less defensible. I went back to the counter. Mrs. Fontenot was waiting for her baguette. I wrapped it, gave her the loyalty stamp, and she patted my hand over the counter and said, "The flower girl is good for you, Cher." I said she was good for business. Mrs. Fontenot gave me the look that 73 years of living in New Orleans gives a person and said, "I know what I said." She took her baguette and left, and I stood there with the stamp in my hand and nowhere to put it. That evening I called my mother in Baton Rouge, which I do every Thursday, and I told her about the gold crust situation and the plan Lily and I had developed, and my mother listened to all of it and then said, "Tell me about Lily." I said there wasn't much to tell. She sold flowers, she had a pink Fusca, she was helping with the marketing strategy. My mother said, "You mentioned her 4 times in the last 2 minutes." I counted back through the conversation. I did not share the count with my mother. She let the silence sit, the way she's always known how to do. And then she said, "Your father and I built that bakery together, you know. Not because we'd planned to, because we kept showing up to the same place every morning until it became the only thing that made sense." I said that was a different situation. She said, "Of course it is." She said it with the particular warmth of someone who doesn't need you to agree with them because they already know they're right. I told her I had to check on the starter culture. She said goodnight and that she loved me, and I stood in the kitchen above the bakery for a long moment before going downstairs. The moment that rearranged something permanent in me happened on a Friday evening, after close, when I was mopping the floor, and Lily knocked on the glass door. She'd left a bucket of white ranunculus on the sidewalk that she'd forgotten in the morning rush, and she'd come back for it. I unlocked the door, and she stepped in, and the bakery was dim and warm and smelled of the day's last bake, and Lily looked around the empty room the way you look at a place when you're seeing it without its usual context, like seeing someone's face when they don't know you're watching. "I've never been in here when it was quiet," she said. I told her it was different at night. She walked slowly to the counter, trailing her hand along the edge of it, and looked at the family photos I keep on the shelf behind the register. My parents at the original location, younger than I've ever really pictured them. Flour on their aprons and my mother laughing at something off camera. Lily looked at the photo for a long time. Then she said, "She has your hands." I looked at the photo. My mother's hands, curved around a rolling pin, strong and certain. I had never noticed. I felt something open in my chest like a window in a room that's been closed too long, and I didn't say anything for a moment because I didn't trust the steadiness of my voice. Lily turned and found me looking at her instead of the photo, and neither of us looked away immediately. Outside, a streetcar passed, its bell a single bright note in the evening. Then Lily picked up her bucket of ranunculus and said, "Same time tomorrow?" I said, "Same time tomorrow." She left. I locked the door. I stood in the middle of my quiet, warm, flour-dusted bakery and pressed both hands flat against the counter, and I told myself very firmly that I was not in trouble. Reader, I was absolutely in trouble. Daphne called Lily that same night. I found out later, much later, in the way you find out the timeline of things after they've already happened, and you're reassembling the sequence to understand what you missed. Daphne called and said she wanted to talk. Not about Goldcrust, about them, about whatever unfinished thing Daphne apparently believed was still unfinished. Lily didn't tell me about the call on Saturday morning. She arrived at 7:20, set up the Fusca, drank her coffee in two hands, and was almost completely normal, except that she'd forgotten to put out the small chalkboard, which she never forgot. And when I brought it out and set it on the sidewalk without saying anything, she looked at me with an expression that had too many layers for that hour of the morning, and said, "How do you always notice?" I said I didn't know. She looked at the chalkboard. She looked at me. She said, "Savannah." And then Mrs. Fontenot arrived, loudly, with a question about the cardamom rolls, and the moment folded and disappeared like it had never been there. But I held on to it. I held on to my name in her mouth and the way there had been something unfinished after it, and I carried it through the whole rest of the day like something I wasn't ready to put down. By the end of that week, 3 things were true simultaneously. Our joint marketing plan was working, with foot traffic up and 2 local food bloggers having posted about the Dauphine Street corner without being asked. Goldcrust's opening was 12 days away, and Daphne had been by twice more, each time a little slower, each time parking a little closer. And somewhere between a rainy morning under an awning and a quiet evening with a photo of my mother's hands, something had shifted between Lily and me that neither of us had named yet, but both of us, I think, were beginning to carry. Ruth summed up the entire situation on Friday afternoon when she looked at me across the counter during a brief lull and said, with the economy of someone who charges by the word, "You're running out of time, Savannah, and I don't mean Goldcrust." I opened my mouth. I closed it. I wiped down the counter, which did not need wiping. Ruth picked up her crossword and said nothing further, because she had already said everything, and she knew it. The bread burned on a Monday, which felt appropriate. Mondays in a bakery are already an exercise in controlled chaos. The weekend orders, the restocking, the particular exhaustion of having been open 7 days and knowing you'll be open 7 more. And this Monday had the additional feature of Daphne Rousseau having sent Lily a follow-up text that Lily had not responded to, but had also not deleted. Which I knew because Lily had shown me her phone with the text visible, and then immediately regretted showing me, I think, based on the way she put the phone back in her pocket and picked up her coffee with both hands and looked out the window at the Fusca like it owed her an explanation. I had said nothing about the text. I had gone back to the kitchen and promptly let an entire tray of sourdough boolies go 7 minutes past done because I was standing at the oven thinking about the way Lily's jaw had tightened when she looked at that screen, and Ruth had come to the kitchen door and said very calmly, "Savannah, your bread." And I had pulled the tray out and stood there looking at the dark, overdone loaves, and felt something that had absolutely nothing to do with bread. I don't burn bread. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to the story, and also to my professional identity. I have been baking since I was 9 years old, standing on a step stool beside my mother, and in 25 years of working with dough, I have developed the particular internal clock that good bakers have, the one that doesn't require a timer because the smell changes, the air changes, something in the room shifts when the bread is ready. I know that clock the way I know my own breathing. And on that Monday morning, Lily Tran's jaw had overridden 25 years of muscle memory, which told me something I was not yet prepared to say out loud. I wrapped the burned loaves in paper and set them by the back door for the compost. And I started a new batch, and I did not think about the text. I thought about the text the entire time. Lily came in around 9, after the morning rush had thinned, and she leaned against the counter in her usual spot and said, "Daphne wants to meet." She said it to the middle distance, not quite to me, the way you say something you've been rehearsing. I kept my hands on the counter. I asked if she was going to. Lily turned her coffee cup in slow circles on the marble and said she didn't know, which I understood was not actually about not knowing. It was about not yet having decided how much of the answer she wanted to examine. I know that particular not knowing. I've lived in it. I said, "What does she want?" Lily said, "She says she made a mistake." The words landed in the space between us with a weight I felt in my back teeth. And I did the thing I've been trained by 12 years of business ownership to do, which is keep my face perfectly neutral while my internal landscape rearranges itself entirely. I said, "And what do you think?" Lily finally looked at me directly and said, "I think I'm asking the wrong person." I held her gaze. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you're not objective." The air in the bakery did something. I said, "No, I'm not." And then Mrs. Fontenot's granddaughter came in with a birthday cake order, and the conversation ended with the clean, brutal efficiency of real life, which has no interest whatsoever in dramatic timing. The gold crust situation escalated that same week with the precision of a second problem that has been waiting politely for the first problem to tire you out before introducing itself. Their marketing team had clearly done their research. They launched a social campaign targeting every French Quarter food hashtag, dropped a sponsored post featuring a quote about authentic neighborhood baking that made me put my phone face down on the counter and take 3 slow breaths, and announced a partnership with a local jazz musician for their opening weekend that was, objectively, a smart move I wished I'd thought of. I sat with our numbers on Wednesday evening and looked at what we'd built versus what Gold Crust was bringing, and the honest assessment was that we were good, but they were loud. And loud has a way of winning arguments that good doesn't always anticipate. I stayed at the table until 11. I made notes. I revised the plan. I did not call Lily, because it was late, and also because I was not sure I could talk to her about the plan without talking about the other thing, and I wasn't ready for the other thing. She called me. At 11:40, which is deeply unreasonable, and I answered on the second ring, which tells you everything about where I actually was with the other thing. She said, "Are you still at the bakery?" I said yes. She said, "I can see your light." I went to the window. The Fusca was parked on the street below, not in its morning spot, but across the way, in the dark, and I could see the pale shape of Lily sitting on the hood with her phone to her ear, her legs crossed, looking up at my window. I raised my hand. She raised hers. We stayed like that for a moment, 2 women on either side of a pane of glass and 11 feet of October air. And then she said, "I didn't meet with Daphne." I said, "Okay." She said, "I wanted you to know." I said, "Okay." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has furniture in it, that you can move around in without bumping into things. Then she said, "Go to sleep, Savannah." And I said, "You too." And she slid off the hood and got in the Fusca and drove away, and I stood at the window until the sound of the engine faded into the French Quarter dark. I told Ruth the next morning. Not everything. I am not someone who tells everything, and Ruth is not someone who needs everything. But enough. I said that I thought something was happening with Lily, and I didn't know what to do with it. Ruth was restocking the pastry case and did not look up. She said, "Something's been happening with Lily since the second week of October." I said I was aware of the timeline. Ruth closed the pastry case and looked at me with the particular expression she reserves for moments when she thinks I am being unnecessarily obtuse. She said, "What are you scared of?" I said I wasn't scared. She waited. I said, "She might still have feelings for Daphne." Ruth said, Does she? I said I didn't know. Ruth said, Have you asked her? I had not asked her. Ruth said, Ask her. She picked up her dish towel and went to the other end of the counter, and that was apparently the entirety of Ruth's counseling session. But in fairness, it was more useful than several things I'd paid for. The opportunity arrived on Thursday, in the form of a broken refrigeration unit in the Fusca's modified cooling compartment, which Lily used to store the more delicate flowers during transport. She discovered the problem at 7 a.m. and stood in front of the open trunk with her hands on her hips, and an expression that was mostly practical problem-solving, but had a thin edge of exhausted frustration underneath it. And I came outside and looked at the cooling unit and could immediately see that the seal had split. I said she could use the small secondary fridge in my back kitchen for the day. She said she didn't want to be a bother. I said she had been parking in front of my bakery for 6 weeks and leaving me flowers every morning, and the time for not being a bother had passed. She laughed, surprised, and then looked at me with something warm and unguarded and said, Okay, thank you. We carried the flowers in together, finding a rhythm between us in the narrow kitchen doorway, passing buckets and blooms back and forth with the ease of people who have learned each other's geometry without meaning to. At some point, we were both in the small kitchen at the same time, surrounded by dahlias and ranunculus, and the smell of the morning's first bake, and it was close and warm, and she was near enough that I could have counted the eyelashes if I'd let myself. I did not count the eyelashes. I asked if she was okay. She said she was tired. I said I knew. She leaned back against the counter beside the proofing rack, and I leaned beside her, and we stood in my kitchen in the morning quiet, and she said, Daphne texted again. I said, I know you didn't answer. She turned her head to look at me. She said, How? I said, Because you would have told me. The certainty in my own voice surprised me. Lily looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, quietly, Yeah, I would have. The proofing oven made its low, cycling sound. Outside, the street was beginning to wake. Voices, a delivery truck, the distant sound of a streetcar bell. I said, Lily. She said, Yeah. I said, I'm not objective. She said, I know. I said, I just want you to know I know that. She nodded, very slowly, and turned back to face the kitchen. And we stood side by side for another moment that I knew would stay with me for a long time, for the particular quality of its honesty. Then she said, The bread smells incredible. I said, It's the cardamom rolls. She said, They smell like the answer to something. I did not disagree. The night the bread burned, and the night Lily sat on the hood of the Fusca in the dark, and the morning in the kitchen with the dahlias. These things had been accumulating, I understood now, in the way that real things accumulate, not with announcements but with weight. And Goldcrest was opening in 5 days, and Daphne was still texting, and Ruth had told me to ask. And I had not yet asked, but I was getting closer to it in the way you get closer to something you've been circling, not in a straight line, but in a spiral, each pass a little tighter than the last. That evening, I sat at the small back table and looked at the joint marketing plan we'd built together on the back of a flower delivery receipt, and I thought about what my mother had said about showing up to the same place every morning until it becomes the only thing that makes sense. Outside, the French Quarter was doing what it does every evening, filling with music and warmth and the particular golden light that falls on Rue Dauphine in November, like it was designed specifically for the street. I turned off the back table lamp. I went upstairs. I did not sleep immediately, but when I did, I dreamed about paper lanterns. The next morning, Friday, 4 days before Goldcrest opened, I arrived at the bakery at 4 as always and found something on the doorstep. A single white ranunculus, tucked under the door handle, with a small note attached in Lily's looping handwriting. The note said, For the record, I'm not objective either. I stood on the dark doorstep of my bakery in the 4 o'clock quiet of the French Quarter, holding a white flower and a 4-word confession. And I felt the spiral complete its last pass. I unlocked the door. I went inside. I started the bread. And for the first time in longer than I could accurately measure, my hands did not shake. I kept the note in my apron pocket for 4 days, not folded neatly, just there, slightly crumpled from where I'd touched it too many times, the paper going soft at the corners from the warmth of the kitchen. I am a person who makes decisions methodically, who reads contracts twice and measures ingredients by weight rather than volume, and keeps a 5-year financial projection updated on the 15th of every month. I am not a person who carries handwritten notes in her apron pocket and takes them out at odd moments to read 4 words she has already memorized. And yet, the note said what it said, and I had said what I had said, and we were existing in this particular suspended state, aware of the thing, circling the thing, neither of us landing on it, while simultaneously running 2 small businesses 4 days out from a corporate competitor's grand opening, which is, objectively, the worst possible timing for a personal reckoning of any kind. I knew this. Lily knew this. We had made a silent, mutual, entirely unspoken agreement to hold the thing in place until after Saturday, and we honored that agreement with the discipline of 2 people who understand that some things deserve better than being said in a hurry. What we did instead was work. The joint campaign we'd built on the back of a flour receipt had, by Thursday morning, generated more organic engagement than anything Maison Dorée had produced in 2 years of sporadic social media effort. Lily had a gift for it that I didn't. She could photograph a bucket of Tuesday dahlias in the morning light and make it look like an argument for being alive. And she wrote captions that were funny and specific and never tried too hard, which is the hardest thing to achieve when you're trying. I handled the numbers, the partnerships, the conversation with the owner of the jazz club 2 blocks over who agreed to let us host a small Friday evening event. Bread, flowers, live music, the kind of thing that can't be replicated by a corporate chain regardless of their marketing budget. We met every morning at the back table, coffee going cold between us, talking through logistics with our heads close together over receipts and printouts, and Ruth moved through the bakery around us with the satisfied quietness of a person watching something they predicted come true on schedule. On Wednesday evening, Daphne came into the bakery. Not past it, not slowly by in the white SUV, into it, at 6:15, 20 minutes before closing, while Lily was still at her table outside finishing the last of her inventory count. I was behind the counter restocking the display case when the door opened, and I knew who it was before I looked up, the same way you know certain things before you have evidence for them. Daphne Rousseau in person was exactly what her LinkedIn photo had suggested, composed, precise, wearing the kind of effortless confidence that comes from having always been the most capable person in every room she'd entered. She looked at the bakery the way her regional manager brain couldn't help looking at things, assessing, cataloging, noting. Then she looked at me and she said, "You must be Savannah." I said, "And you must be Daphne." She smiled, a real smile, I'll give her that, not a corporate one, and said, "She talks about you." I kept my face where I'd put it. I said, "What can I get you?" She said she'd have whatever I recommended, which is the right answer, and I put together a small plate, cardamom roll, a piece of the dark chocolate tart, a café au lait, and she sat at the window table and ate with genuine appreciation, which I also gave her credit for, because the food deserved it regardless of the circumstances. She didn't pretend the visit was accidental. After a few minutes, she looked up from the plate and said, "I'm not here to cause problems." I said, "Okay," she said, "I mean that." I said, "I believe you mean it." She looked at me steadily and said, "But you don't believe it's true." I wiped down the counter, which did not need wiping, and said, "I think you drove a white SUV past this corner 4 times in 2 weeks, and then walked in 20 minutes before close on a Wednesday. And I think you know exactly what you're doing." The directness surprised her. I could see it. But she absorbed it cleanly, which told me something about her. She said, "I hurt her." I said, "I know." She said, "I'd like the chance to explain that to her." And here is where I had to be very careful with myself, because the version of me that had been carrying a note in her apron pocket for 4 days wanted to say something territorial and slightly irrational, and the version of me that has run a business for 12 years and understands that you don't get to make other people's choices for them, said, instead, "That's between you and Lily." Daphne looked at me for a long moment. She said, "You're in love with her." I said nothing. She nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something. She said, "Does she know?" I said, "Finish your tart." She finished her tart. She left a 20 on the table for a $12 order, and at the door she turned and said, "For what it's worth, she lights up when she talks about you. She never did that with me." The door closed. I stood in the empty bakery and heard those words settle into the room like flour through a sifter, slow and fine and covering everything. Lily came in 10 minutes later to collect the dahlia bucket she'd left by the back door, and I was behind the counter with my hands wrapped around a coffee I wasn't drinking, and she looked at my face and said, "What happened?" I said, "Daphne came in." Lily went very still. She set the bucket down. She said, "What did she say?" I gave her the honest version, not all of it, but the shape of it, the part about wanting to explain, the part about not meaning to cause problems. I did not give her the last part, the part about lighting up, because that felt like something that belonged to me to carry for a little longer. Lily listened with her arms crossed and her eyes on the middle distance. And when I finished, she was quiet for long enough that I started reviewing everything I'd said for errors. Then she said, "Are you okay?" Which was, I want to note, not the question I had been expecting, and it landed somewhere undefended. I said, "I'm fine." She said, "Savannah." I said, "I'm fine, Lily." She looked at me with the expression she gets when she has decided not to push, but wants me to know she sees through me, and she picked up the bucket and said, "Friday's going to be good. The plan is good." I said, "I know." She said, "And Saturday, whatever happens with Goldcrust, we'll handle it." I said, "I know." She paused at the door and said, "And the other thing." I said, "What other thing?" She said, "You know what other thing." And she left, and I stood there with my cold coffee and the ghost of Daphne's last words and the absolute certainty that Friday was going to be the longest day of my recent adult life. Friday arrived with the particular golden excess that New Orleans reserves for days when it wants to remind you that you live somewhere extraordinary. The light on Rue Dauphine at 7 in the morning was the color of warm honey, and Lily had the Fusca decorated to its absolute maximum. Every pot filled, bundles of dried cotton and late-season roses threaded through the roof rack, the hand-lettered chalkboard rewritten in 2 colors, a small strand of Edison bulbs already strung between the car and my awning in anticipation of the evening. She was on a ladder when I arrived, tying the last bulb into place, and she looked down at me from up there, with her hair catching the morning light, and said, "Good morning, bakery." The same thing she'd said on the very first day. I looked up at her and felt the accumulated weight of 6 weeks press against the back of my sternum, warm and enormous and entirely mine, and I said, "Get down from the ladder, Lily." She climbed down. We stood on the sidewalk in the gold morning, and she said, "Ready?" I said, "Yes." We opened. The Friday evening event was, without question, the best thing that had happened to Maison Dorée in years. Marcus from the jazz club brought 2 musicians, upright bass and trumpet, and they set up on the sidewalk at 6 and played the kind of music that makes strangers slow down and stay, the kind that turns a corner into a room. We sold out of the cardamom rolls by 6:30. Lily sold the last of the roses at 7. People bought bread and flowers and stood on the sidewalk in the warm November evening and listened to the music and talked to each other, and Ruth worked the register with quiet pride, and I moved between the kitchen and the counter and the sidewalk and kept looking for Lily in the crowd and finding her, laughing with a customer, adjusting a bucket, talking to Marcus between sets with her head tilted and her hands moving the way they do when she's genuinely engaged with something. Once, across the width of the sidewalk and through a small crowd of people, she found me looking and held it for a moment. Just a moment, just long enough. And then someone asked her something and she turned away. And I went back inside and stood in my kitchen and pressed my hands flat on the counter and breathed. Daphne did not appear. I had been expecting her, in the low-level, vigilant way I'd been tracking the white SUV for 2 weeks, and her absence was both a relief and a different kind of tension, the kind that comes from knowing something is still unresolved. At 8:30, when the crowd had thinned and Marcus was playing something slow and low, and the Edison bulbs were the main light on the sidewalk, I came outside with 2 glasses of water and found Lily sitting on the hood of the Fusca, shoes off, watching the last few people linger. I sat beside her. The hood was warm from the day. The trumpet was playing something that had no particular hurry to it. She took the water and said, "We did something good tonight." I said, "We did." She said, "Mom, the bakery was full." I said, "You sold out of roses." She said, "People kept asking if we were together." I looked at the Edison bulbs. I said, "What did you tell them?" She said, "I told them we were partners." I said, "That's accurate." She said, "Is it?" I turned to look at her. She was already looking at me, and the trumpet was still playing, and the French Quarter was doing its ancient, unhurried thing all around us, and I thought, I have been circling this for 6 weeks, and I am tired of the circumference. I said, "Lily." She said, "Yeah." I said, "Tomorrow is going to be a hard day." She said, "I know." I said, "Ask me again after tomorrow." She looked at me for a long moment, reading something in my face that I had stopped trying to hide, and then she nodded, slowly, and turned back to the street. We sat on the hood of the pink Fusca in the November evening and listened to the trumpet finish its thought, and neither of us said anything else, and it was the most honest conversation I'd had in years. Saturday arrived at 4 a.m. the way Saturdays always do. Indifferent to my nerves, indifferent to the fact that Goldcrust was opening 6 hours from now 2 blocks away, indifferent to the note in my apron pocket, and the conversation on the car hood, and everything that was sitting in the air between Lily and me waiting for its moment. I made bread. I made it carefully, attentively, with the full weight of my attention on the dough and the oven and the smell of the kitchen, the way my mother taught me. At 6:15, Lily texted, "On my way, bringing something." At 6:50, the Fusca engine announced itself on the quiet street, and I went to the window and watched her park, and she got out carrying a flat of white gardenias, not her usual inventory, not something she sold, and she began placing them in the terracotta pots along the Fusca's bumper, one by one, with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. White gardenias. The flower that smelled like the first morning. I stood at the window and understood that she remembered, and the understanding arrived not as surprise, but as the quiet, certain recognition of something you'd known for a while, finally stepping into the light. I put on my apron. I unlocked the door. I went to start the day. Goldcrust opened at 10 a.m. with a ribbon the color of their logo. Thick gold satin, cut by a woman in a blazer, who was not Daphne, but could have been Daphne in a parallel universe where everything was slightly more corporate and slightly less human. I know this because Ruth described it to me in real time from the sidewalk, having appointed herself intelligence officer for the morning without anyone asking her to, sending me periodic text updates while I worked the counter during the Saturday rush. The texts read, in sequence, big crowd, lots of free samples. Then, jazz trio, smart. Then, free tote bags. People love a tote bag. Then, after a pause of 11 minutes, their croissants are not as good as yours. I had one. For research. I showed Lily the last text during a brief lull, and she laughed so suddenly she nearly spilled her coffee, and I thought, whatever today costs, that was worth it. The morning was good. Better than good. It was the kind of Saturday that reminds you why you built something in a particular place, and not somewhere easier. The gardenias Lily had placed in the terracotta pots filled the sidewalk with a scent so specific and so generous that people stopped mid-stride, turned, and followed it to the source the way you follow music you didn't know you were looking for. Lily's inventory was the best I'd seen. She had clearly planned it, had ordered specifically for this day, and the Fusca looked like something from a dream, every surface carrying color and life, and the particular warmth of a thing that was made by hand for a reason. Inside, I had baked more than usual, and baked well, and Ruth managed the line with the efficiency of someone who takes Saturday personally, and by 11 o'clock we had served more customers than any Saturday in the previous 3 months. I tracked the numbers in my head the way I always do, and felt something loosen in my chest. Not victory exactly, but the particular relief of having prepared well for something and having the preparation hold. What I had not prepared for was my landlord. At 11:40, between the morning rush and the lunch wave, a man named Gerald Thibodeau arrived at Maison Dorée in a seersucker suit, and the expression of someone who has been putting off a conversation and has finally run out of reasons. Gerald owned the building and 4 others on the block, and he had been my landlord for 9 years, and in 9 years he had raised my rent twice, reasonably with notice, and with the particular New Orleans gentility that makes even bad news feel like it has good manners. He asked if we could speak privately. I brought him to the back table. I did not offer him a cardamom roll, which tells you something about what I already sensed. He sat down, folded his hands, and told me that Goldcrust had approached him about the building. Not about my unit, about the whole building. They wanted to expand their footprint. They had made an offer that Gerald described, with visible discomfort, as significant. He said he hadn't accepted. He also said he hadn't declined. He said he wanted me to know before he made any decisions, because 9 years meant something to him. I listened to all of this with both hands flat on the table, and I said, "How long do I have?" He said, 30 days to make a counter-argument. I said, "What would constitute a counter-argument?" He said, "Something that demonstrates the long-term viability of the current use." He meant numbers. He meant proof that Maison Dorée was a better investment than a Goldcrust expansion. He said it with kindness, and left with a cardamom roll after all, because by the time he stood up, I had remembered that none of this was personal, and Gerald Thibodeau had given me 30 days when he didn't have to give me anything. I sat at the back table alone for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I counted. Not deliberately, just the way your mind reaches for something concrete when everything else is shifting. 30 days. The lease I had assumed was stable. The building I had assumed was mine in every way that mattered. The bakery my parents had built with borrowed faith in a foreign city. 4 minutes. Then I stood up, straightened my apron, and went back to the counter, because the lunch wave was coming and the bread wasn't going to serve itself, and I am, at my core, a person who responds to crisis by baking something and figuring out the rest while the oven runs. Ruth looked at my face when I came through the curtain and said nothing, which meant she read it exactly right. She handed me the order pad. I took it. We worked. I didn't tell Lily until the afternoon. I had reasons: the Saturday rush, the timing, the fact that she had her own day to manage. But the real reason was simpler and less dignified. I needed to absorb the information before I shared it, needed to carry it alone for a few hours until it stopped feeling like the ground shifting and started feeling like a problem with potential solutions. That is a thing I do, and I know I do it, and it has cost me before. At 3 o'clock, when the sidewalk had quieted and Lily was reorganizing the last of her inventory in the Fusca's trunk, I went outside with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the low step by the door and told her. All of it. Gerald, the offer, the 30 days, the counter-argument that needed to be built. I told it plainly, without the protective scaffolding of professionalism, because she had put white gardenias in terracotta pots that morning, and I was done managing the distance. Lily listened without interrupting, which is not her natural mode. She is someone who thinks out loud, who builds responses in real time. So her silence was its own form of attention, the focused kind that costs something. When I finished, she sat beside me on the step and was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Tell me what you need. Not what can I do, or it'll be okay, or any of the other phrases that mean well and land soft. Tell me what you need." 5 words that assumed I knew, that assumed the answer mattered, that assumed she was willing to meet it. I looked at the Fusca, at the gardenias, at the hand-lettered sign that said our names and our address, and I said, "I need data. Traffic numbers, revenue correlation, neighborhood impact. Something that shows Gerald that this corner is worth more than what Goldcrust is offering." Lily said, "I have 2 years of sales records by location. I can pull the French Quarter numbers." I said, "That would help." She said, "I also know a woman at the city's Cultural Preservation Office. This block is part of a historic commercial district. There may be a designation argument." I stared at her. She said, "I looked into it when the permit situation started. I like to know the landscape. I looked at this woman who sold flowers from a pink Volkswagen and kept 2 years of sales records by location, and knew someone at the Cultural Preservation Office, and I felt something shift in my understanding of her. Not a revelation exactly, more like a previously unfocused thing coming sharp. She was watching me with the careful attention she brought to things that mattered, and she said, "You thought I was just the flower girl." I said, "I thought you were a lot of things." She said, "What did you think I was?" I said, "The most disruptive thing that's happened to me in years." The corner of her mouth moved. She looked at the street. She said, "I'll take it." We spent the rest of the afternoon at the back table, and it looked like the strategy sessions from the weeks before, but felt entirely different. The stakes were real now, immediate, and something between us had shifted into a register that had no professional category. Lily pulled records on her phone, cross-referencing her sales data with the dates I gave her for our traffic peaks, and the correlation was clear and strong, and exactly the kind of evidence that made a counter-argument. I drafted talking points while she researched the historic district designation, and at some point we had stopped sitting across from each other and were both leaning over the same side of the table, close enough that I could hear her thinking, and Ruth brought us coffee and set it down without a word, and walked away with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something for 6 weeks. At 6 o'clock, Daphne came in. I know. The timing was operatic, and I would have chosen differently if I'd been writing it. But she came in at 6, and Lily was right there at the back table, and there was a moment of the 3 of us in the same room that had a particular, charged quality, like the air before lightning. Daphne looked at the table, at the papers, the coffee cups, the 2 of us close over shared work, and something in her face made a small, quiet adjustment, the kind that costs something to make. She said, "Lily, can we talk?" Lily looked at her, and then looked at me, and I said nothing because I had meant it when I told Daphne it wasn't my decision to make. Lily said, "Okay." I picked up my papers and went to the counter, because I am a person who believes in privacy even when it causes me personal inconvenience, and I stood behind the counter and looked at my mother's photograph and gave them the back table and did not listen, which required more effort than I will admit in this telling. They talked for 20 minutes. I served 2 late customers and wiped down surfaces that were already clean and reorganized the display case by size, which is not how I normally organize it. Ruth had gone home at 5, so it was just me in the bakery and the low sound of conversation from the back that I was absolutely not trying to parse. At 6:20, Daphne came to the counter. She looked at me with an expression that had resolved into something clear, and, I thought, genuine. She said, "You have something good here." I wasn't sure if she meant the bakery or something else, and I think she meant both. She said, "I'm not going to complicate it." She bought a bag of the cardamom rolls, a whole bag, not a single, and she left, and the bell above the door settled into silence, and I stood behind the counter and waited. Lily came out from the back table slowly, with the particular unhurried movement of someone who has just set something down that they've been carrying for a long time. She came to the counter and stood on the other side of it and looked at me, and her eyes were clear, and her face was open in a way that I had learned over 6 weeks to recognize as the real version of her. Not the easy public warmth, not the armor, just Lily, present and unguarded. She said, "She came to say goodbye. She's moving to the Baton Rouge region." I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Really?" She said, "Savannah, I put white gardenias on the car this morning." I looked at her. She looked at me. The bakery was quiet and warm, and smelled of the last bake and the gardenias from outside and the coffee we'd been drinking all day, and the light was doing the thing it does on Rue Dauphine in November, gold and long and specific. I said, "You said to ask you after Saturday." She said, "It's after Saturday." I came around the counter. The distance between us, which had been managed and measured and carefully maintained for 6 weeks, closed in a way that felt less like a decision and more like a conclusion. The last line of something that had been building for a long time, arriving with the quiet certainty of bread that's ready. She was looking at me with that slow, door-opening expression from the very first morning, and I raised my hand and tucked a loose piece of her hair back, and she leaned into it just slightly. And I said her name once, the way you say something you've been waiting to say in the right moment. And then I told her, not with a question, with the plain, unhurried truth that had been in my apron pocket for 4 days and in my chest for considerably longer. I should tell you what I said. I know you've been waiting for it. 6 chapters, 6 weeks of flower and flowers and carefully managed distance, and you want the words. I understand. But here's the thing about the words. They were ordinary. They didn't arrive in a speech or a grand declaration or anything that would look particularly impressive written down. I said, "I think I've been in love with you since you handed me a drawing of a flower and called it a permit." That was it. No poetry, no carefully constructed sentence. Just the plain, slightly embarrassing truth delivered in a bakery that smelled like gardenias and the end of a very long Saturday, to a woman who was already smiling before I finished saying it. Not the public smile, not the easy one, but the quiet one she kept closer, the one I had spent 6 weeks learning to recognize as the real thing. She said, "That was day 1. I said, "I know. I'm a slow study." She laughed, and the laugh was warm and close and directed entirely at me. And then she said, "No, you're careful. There's a difference." And I thought, there it is. There's the thing. 6 weeks of being seen by someone who bothered to look, and it lands like that. Not like a wave, but like a hand finding yours in the dark. Steady, certain, already there. The kiss was quiet. That's the word I keep coming back to. Quiet. Not tentative, not restrained. Just quiet, the way things are when they've been earned. It lasted the length of a breath and tasted like coffee, and the very end of a hard day. And when it was done, we stayed close for a moment, foreheads nearly touching, and she said, "I've been waiting for you to come around the counter for a while." I said, "Ruth told me to." She pulled back to look at me. She said, "Ruth told you to kiss me?" I said, "Ruth told me to ask you something." I extrapolated. Lily laughed again, and I felt it against my cheek, and I thought, I will remember this specific configuration of things for the rest of my life. The light, the smell, the sound of that laugh in the warm quiet of my mother's bakery on a November evening in New Orleans. Some moments know their moments while they're happening. This was one of those. Ruth found out Monday morning. She arrived at 7, looked at the small vase of white gardenias on the counter by the register. Lily's gardenias, the ones from the Fusca's terracotta pots, which I had brought inside Saturday evening. And then she looked at me with the expression of a woman reviewing a prediction she made 6 weeks ago and finding it confirmed in every particular. She said, "Finally." I said, "Good morning, Ruth." She said, "I've been watching you reorganize the display case by size for 3 Saturdays." I said, "The display case is fine." She said, "The display case is organized by size, which is not how you normally do it, which means you were nervous, which means I was right." She picked up her dish towel. She said, "I'm glad, baby." Just that. I'm glad. From Ruth, delivered to the display case rather than to my face, which is exactly how Ruth says the things that matter most. I went to the kitchen and checked on the morning bread, and allowed myself, in private, to be completely, quietly happy. The 30-day counter-argument to Gerald Thibodeau took 11 days to build and 4 hours to present. Lily's sales data, correlated with my traffic records, demonstrated a 43% increase in foot traffic at the corner since October. Not just for Maison Dorée, but for the 3 neighboring businesses that had provided their own numbers when I asked. Because it turns out people in a neighborhood will show up for a fight when they understand what they're fighting for. The cultural preservation argument, developed with Lily's contact at the city office, positioned the Maison Dorée building as a contributing structure in the Faubourg Marigny historic commercial corridor, which introduced a layer of municipal consideration that made a straight commercial sale considerably more complicated. Gerald listened to all of it at the back table. Where else? With the careful attention of a man who owns 4 buildings and understands the difference between a transaction and a legacy. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your parents would be proud." I said, "I know." He said he would be declining Goldcrust's offer. He said he'd also be extending my lease by 5 years at current rate, which he delivered with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who has been waiting for the right reason to do it. I shook his hand. He took a cardamom roll. He left. I went to the back kitchen and sat on the floor for approximately 90 seconds, which is something I have never done before or since, and which felt entirely appropriate. Goldcrust did not close. I want to be honest about that, because this is not a story where the villain disappears and the problem resolves itself cleanly. They opened, they operated, they drew customers. There were Saturdays in November and December where the line outside their door was longer than mine, and I watched it from my window and felt the specific discomfort of someone who has chosen the harder path and is living with the texture of that choice. But there were also Saturdays where the line outside my door extended to the corner, and Lily had sold out of flowers by 9, and Marcus from the jazz club had started coming by on Friday evenings without being asked, just because he liked the corner, and Mrs. Fontenot had begun bringing her grandchildren on Saturday mornings, and teaching them to ask for things in French, and the Dauphine Street corner had become, without anyone formally deciding it should be, a place where people came to feel like they were somewhere real. You cannot manufacture that. You cannot franchise it. And Goldcrust, to their institutional credit, seemed to understand this. Because Daphne's replacement, a younger man named Patrick who had none of Daphne's precision and considerably more warmth, started coming in on Tuesday mornings for a baguette, and eventually admitted that he'd been sent to study what we were doing and hadn't been able to figure out how to replicate it. I told him it wasn't replicable. He said he was starting to understand that. I gave him a cardamom roll and told him to say hello to his team. What changed and what didn't. The bakery was the same. The 4 o'clock mornings, the particular smell of the kitchen before the city woke up, the weight of the rolling pin, the sound of the proofing oven cycling, all of it exactly as it had always been, and all of it somehow different. The difference was the Fusca parked outside. The difference was coffee made with 1 sugar, not 2. The difference was that on Tuesday mornings, when the bakery was quietest, Lily would bring her laptop inside and work at the back table, not because we'd decided she would, but because she'd started doing it, and I'd stopped pretending I didn't prefer the bakery when she was in it. She had a habit of reading things out loud when she found them interesting, which should have been disruptive and wasn't, and a habit of bringing in whatever flour had been left over from the morning and setting it on the counter without comment. And after a while, the flowers became as much a part of the bakery's atmosphere as the bread, and Ruth updated the menu board to include them in the ambiance description, which she did without asking me, which is very Ruth. My mother came to visit in December, the first time in 8 months, and she arrived on a Saturday morning and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment looking at the corner, the Fusca, the gardenias, the Edison bulbs still strung between the car and my awning, the chalkboard with both our names. And then she came inside and found me behind the counter and held my face in her hands the way she's done since I was small. And she looked at me for a long moment and said, "There you are. Not hello, not how are you. There you are." As if she'd been looking for a version of me that had been elsewhere for a while and had finally found her way back. I said, "Hi, Mama." She said, "Where is she?" I nodded toward the sidewalk, where Lily was talking to Mrs. Fontenot with animated hands and a gardenia tucked behind her ear that she'd put there herself because she'd been arranging them and had one left over. My mother watched for a moment and then said softly, in Portuguese, the language she uses for things that matter most, "She has a good face." I said, "She does." My mother patted my cheek and went to introduce herself, and I watched from the window as Lily turned and saw her coming, and immediately extended her hand and said something that made my mother laugh. A real laugh, the generous kind. And I thought about the first morning, about the flour on my cheek, and the burn on my wrist, and the complete absence of emotional armor. And I thought, the vulnerability was the point. The softness was never the problem. It was always the door. There is a photograph. Ruth took it, without asking, on a Tuesday in late December when the light was doing something particularly unreasonable on Rue Dauphine. In the photograph, Lily is sitting on the hood of the Fusca, and I am standing beside her, both of us looking at something outside the frame, and my hand is resting on her knee with the ease of something that has always been there. The Fusca is decorated for the season. Lily had wound small branches of holly through the roof rack and replaced the terracotta pots with ones painted in deep winter colors. And behind us, the bakery window shows the warm light from inside, the bread in the display case, the gardenias by the register. Ruth printed the photo and put it on the shelf next to the picture of my parents, younger than I've ever really pictured them. Flour on their aprons, my mother laughing at something off camera. She put it there without asking. I noticed and said nothing. The two photographs sit side by side now, and sometimes in the early mornings before anyone arrives, I look at them and think about my mother's hands around a rolling pin, and Lily saying she has your hands, and I think about what it means to build something in a place and stay long enough for the place to give something back. This is what it gave back. The bakery is still here. The Fusca is still parked outside. On the morning I'm telling you this from, a Tuesday in January, the city still dark at 4, the kitchen warm and smelling of the first bake. Lily is at the back table with her laptop and a coffee that has gone cold, reading something she'll tell me about in approximately 12 minutes when she finds the part that interests her. Ruth arrives at 7. Mrs. Fontenot arrives at 7:45. The bread is almost ready. The gardenias in the terracotta pots are frost tender, and I brought them inside last week, and they're on the windowsill now, where the morning light finds them first. My ex came in once more, in November, alone this time, and ordered a croissant, and I gave her the loyalty stamp, because I could afford to. The burn on my left wrist has faded to a thin silver line. The note is still in my apron pocket. I put it there every morning when I tie the apron, the same way my mother put her mother's recipe card in her pocket every day. Not because she needed to read it, but because some things belong close. Lily asked me once why I still kept it. I said, because it was the first true thing. She said, what was the second? I said, everything after. She looked at me with the slow, door-opening smile from the very first morning, and I went back to the bread, and the bread was good, and the day began the way the best days begin, quietly, warmly, with the particular certainty of someone who knows exactly where she is and has chosen with her whole self to be there. And that's the whole story. From the morning my ex walked in with someone new, and I had absolutely nothing to protect myself with, to a Tuesday in January with cold coffee and gardenias on the windowsill and someone at my back table who reads things out loud when she finds them interesting. I didn't plan any of it. I just kept making bread and answering the door when someone knocked, and it turned out that was enough. But now I need to know something from you. And I mean this sincerely, because this is the part where you become part of the story too. I want you to tell me in the comments, what was the moment you knew? Not necessarily about a person, about anything. The moment you realized something had shifted, and there was no going back to before. A job, a city, a decision, a person standing on your sidewalk with a bucket of sunflowers and a drawing of a flower that was not, technically, a valid permit. We all have a moment like that. I want to read yours. And if this story kept you company, if you listened to all 7 chapters and felt something real in any of it, then you already know what I'm going to ask. Hit subscribe. Not for the algorithm, not for the numbers, but because there are more stories where this one came from. More 4 o'clock mornings and bad timing and people who show up and change the shape of things. More Lilies. More Ruths who know everything 6 weeks before you do. More moments where the only thing left to do is come around the counter. Every single one of them is waiting for you here. Don't miss the next one.